October 18th, initiation issue is raised concerning one Indian gentleman. All right, here he must deal with another illogical, not really their argument that the GBC have made in a desperate attempt to grasp at straws, trying to keep their multi-guru path from sinking. It is on this day that the GBC and their supporters, more recently at least, not back in 1977, but in more recent years, the GBC have claimed that on this day, His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada actually gave his order to the Rtviks for them to then become actual gurus at that date, on October 18th. The reason, time after time, argument after argument, that these arguments given by the GBC to support their concocted system and to discredit Srila Prabhupada's authorized system, the Rtvik Representative of the Acharya system, the reason why these arguments keep winding up evaporating into thin air when we take the time to test their logical prowess and analyze their actual substance is very simple. All of their arguments are trying to argue for a system that Srila Prabhupada never wanted. He never gave any guidance on how it was to work, etc. Their arguments are doomed to fail and cannot hold water because the system they are arguing to uphold isn't even a real system. It is itself bogus and founded on a false premise and flawed understanding of what Srila Prabhupada was actually saying on May 28th. Although to some, at first glance, they may think that the GBC have made a really good point here, which I'm going to give shortly. But in the end, there is no point at all to their argument. Let's listen first to the actual conversation in question.
One Bengali gentleman has come from New York.
Yes, Mr. Sukamal Rai Chaudhary.
So, I have deputed some of you to initiate.
Yes, actually, yes, Srila Prabhupada.
I think Jayapataka can do that. If you like. I have already deputed. Tell him.
Yeah.
So, deputy Jayapataka's name was there.
It is already on there, Srila Prabhupada.
Huh?
His name was on that list.
So I deputed him to do this. That's my fault. And he may go with him. I stopped all the time. Is that all right?
Stop doing what, Srila Prabhupada?
This initiation I have deputed my disciple. Is it clear or not?
It's clear.
You have got the list of the names?
Yeah, Srila Prabhupada.
Hmm. Anyway, Kirtan today, I recover from the condition, then I shall be there. Or I may not be. But in this condition, to initiate is not good. Hmm?
We will explain to him so that he will understand properly.
Hmm? Hmm?
I said, we will explain to the Bengali gentleman, just as you have described to us, so that he'll be satisfied with this arrangement.
That is from a room conversation October 18th, 1977 in Vrindavan. The GBC's argument is based on the following statements, and I'll just read the transcript. Prabhupada, so I depute him to do this at Mayapur, and you may go with him. I stop for the time being. Is that all right? Tamal Krishna, stop doing what, Srila Prabhupada? Prabhupada, this initiation. I have deputed thee, my disciples. Is it clear or not? So Srila Prabhupada says, I stop for the time being. And Tamal asks, stop doing what, Srila Prabhupada? And Prabhupada says, this initiation. The GBC's argument is that with the July 9th letter, Srila Prabhupada had already stopped performing all the external physical aspects of the initiation, except for giving the actual spiritual diksha. Therefore, they argue that the only thing left for Srila Prabhupada to now stop doing in October is to stop giving the actual diksha. Therefore, the GBC argued that Srila Prabhupada wasn't asking Jayapataka Maharaj on that day to initiate this Bengali man as a Rtvik representative on behalf of Srila Prabhupada, but that Srila Prabhupada was actually saying that he was now stopping with giving the actual initiation, since he had already stopped performing all the other aspects, the Rtvik aspects of the initiation. The only thing left for him to do now was to stop giving the actual diksha. Therefore, the GBC had argued that this is it. This conversation, they finally figured it out after many years, but this conversation, they started claiming, is where His Divine Grace was giving his order to the Rtviks to now become regular gurus, and they are to perform the actual diksha. To some, they found this argument and logic given by the GBC to be logically sound and reasonable. After all, they argued, as of July 9th, Srila Prabhupada had already stopped performing all the other aspects of the initiation process, except the giving of Diksha. On October 18th, he had nothing else he could stop in relation to the initiation process other than to stop being the actual Diksha Guru. I'm not exactly sure when the GBC discovered this game-changing realization, but they most certainly did not come to that realization back in October of 1977. The first I heard about this argument, was around 2008. I had heard this actually same argument was given to me from two different ISKCON gurus. One was a GBC and the other was just a sannyasi. They both sent me emails, and each one of them separately made the same claim. And those emails came within actually days of one another. So I'm pretty sure maybe the GBC came to this conclusion around 2008, but at least those two devotees sent me that email on just days apart. And both of them made the same claims and used the same talking points. They wrote that one of the main arguments given by the Rtvik-RAS supporters is that Srila Prabhupada had never given his order for the Rtviks to become regular gurus. And that the Rtvik supporters have argued that without the direct and explicit order, none of them can claim to be guru. Prabhupada taught that one must be given that direct order by one's own guru before one can become guru. For decades, the GBC have been trying in vain to argue that Prabhupada gave his order on the May 28th meeting, or that he had given his order, so many times before. But when you analyze no, Prabhupada actually had not. Like the April 22nd conversation, Prabhupada said he's still waiting to give his order. So no, all those other times before, that was just expressing his desire that his disciples will become guru after he departs. But those were not direct orders. So this point that the Rtvik-RAS supporters have been making was haunting the GBC. They couldn't point to when Srila Prabhupada had actually given them the order for those men to become regular gurus. Then someone must have been going through the Veda base and found this conversation and shouted, "Eureka! I found it." Both of these sannyasis, they were both sannyasi gurus, sent me each their own separate email. They both boasted how this was it. This was when Srila Prabhupada actually gave that order. They both told me that it was now game over. The Rtvik-RAS supporters had lost the final round. What they had been considering was the key Rtvik-RAS argument, that the order had not been given, was now totally and completely defeated. It was over. The GBC won. The Rtvik-RAS supporters have lost. They claimed that it was time to stop trying to defeat them and to join them. This conversation was it. This is what the GBC had been looking for decades, and now they thought they had finally found it. This is where Srila Prabhupada stopped performing the actual giving of initiation as a Diksha Guru. This is where he gave the order to the Rtvik representatives to now become the actual real Guru, the actual Diksha Guru. It took the GBC, over 30 years at that time to realize that this is what Srila Prabhupada was telling them that day, because that wasn't how they understood it at the time in 1977. 30 years later, they came to that realization. The one guru told me that this has driven the final proverbial nail in the coffin of the Rtvik-RAS idea. Both gurus were beaming over with confidence that this argument marked the final defeat of the Rtvik-RAS idea. The debate was over once and for all. The GBC had won, and this was the last and final battle. So I hadn't read the transcript yet of that conversation before I got the first email. I found out later that this conversation was actually in the book, The Final Order, but actually I've never even yet to this day sat down and read the entire Final Order book, although I have seen parts of it quoted now and then. If you've watched my personal story, you will see that I had been opposed to the Rtvik-RAS idea right up until around 1999. When that book had come out, the GBC had labeled it poisonous, and so I avoided it. When I got the first email, it was from Rtviks Maharaj, who I had had some association with for some years. And I first read what the GBC's argument was that he gave in his email, and then I read the transcript. By the way, Rtviks presented this and the GBC's presentation, I was really anticipating something very, very, clear, convincing. So I was really curious to find out what it was. So I pulled up the transcript and began reading. Instead, I actually burst out laughing out loud. Even despite this being such a serious issue, I literally almost fell off my chair laughing my head off. I couldn't believe the fallacy of their position. Sure, just reading the way they presented it, it sounded like they had a quite solid argument. But it all evaporated into thin air and totally disappeared when I read the actual transcript of what Srila Prabhupada was really saying. From reading the transcript, and I understood that the argument the GBC gave, they made one major assumption, and that assumption was totally false. Understanding it correctly just smashed their conclusion to pieces. There was no there. There was no it there either. I replied to Rtvik's email, and I laid out my opposing arguments and shredded the GBC's arguments, which I'll present shortly. Rtvik and I had been on a friendly basis for quite a few years before this. At the time he sent this email, though, I was living in Albuquerque, but before then, I was living in Orlando, where he was living, and we went to the same preaching center. In fact, I was the one who invited him to come there to that preaching center when he told me one time he was looking for a new base where he could engage in college preaching. So I invited him to come to the Orlando Center. And online, we had been associating for years on online conferences on the Dharma issue. So after I sent him my response and then asked him if he wanted, we could debate and discuss this issue further, he wrote back telling me that he was setting my email address as junk mail, that he would no longer see any of the emails I sent him. He did not want to communicate with me anymore. He told me that this argument was it. The GBC had totally defeated the Rtvik side, and since I refused to accept their arguments, he labeled me the fanatic and said that I had become a totally lost case, and because I wouldn't accept the GBC side, their arguments that I was insubordinate, I was fallen and offensive, and he no longer wanted to associate with me again. He didn't want to even have correspondence with me again. By the way, his actions and the way he reacted, that's the definition of a fanatic. I had asked him if he didn't accept my arguments, or if he wanted an ongoing discussion. I was open to an ongoing, and I invited it. I was looking forward to an ongoing discussion and debate on a philosophical basis, intellectual and philosophical basis. He is the one who basically threw a tantrum, calling me names and then refusing to communicate with me. That is how a fanatic reacts when they're defeated and they don't know they don't have a counter argument to give. They wind up just calling the other person's names and refusing to communicate with them. That's fanatic. Now, I wasn't the fanatic. Anyway, by the way, as chance would have it, I wound up moving back to Florida like 5 years later, and again started coming to the Orlando Center since my family and I were friends with a number of devotees at the center. So we started coming back to the Orlando Center. And so Rtvik and I would associate again, but only in that we would just say Haribol to one another when we saw each other at the temple. Actually, we never really got into a good, friendly relationship after that. But the second guru was the GBC for the New Mexico, where I was running a small preaching center. We had had a few friendly exchanges email exchanges previously. But when he sent me this email with this October 18th argument, and when I wrote him my response, he also totally stopped corresponding with me after that. He didn't reply to my email even. He just stopped corresponding. These men seem to be, one pony shows. The GBC came up with this argument and they jumped on board. But when I shot that argument down and asked them for additional discussion and debate, they had such an aversion to philosophical debate and discussion that they slammed the door and ran away, calling me the fanatic. They had thought their argument was it. They believed this was it, and because the GBC had told them that this was it. And when it wasn't really it, they had nothing more to say. As soon as their view and logic was challenged, they acted like sore losers, like small children, call the other side names and then run away. Haribol, this is a voice-only insert. I felt, I should, ask for some forgiveness here and apologize for, naming, especially Rtviks, naming him out on this, and then, saying what I just said. But on the other hand, it is the way I perceived it. I feel I have told it, the way, when I sent back my email to him asking, for further debate and discussion if he, wanted. If he didn't accept my understanding, I was willing to engage in further intellectual debate. And they're the ones that just slammed the door. You just said, I don't want, don't send me any more email. I'm blacklisting you. I'm putting your email in junk. I'm not going to see your emails anymore. I don't want to communicate with you. And you're a fallen. And he's the one who's calling me fallen. He called me, out. So I am calling him out. But not in a vindictive way. I'm just trying to show that this is the arguments they gave me. He was one of the ones who was giving the GBC's arguments to me. This is their arguments. This is what he was giving me. And I replied back. And that was what happened. I'm just sharing what happened. All right. Anyway, but I do ask for, his forgiveness for, Srila Prabhupada stayed friendly with Sridhar Maharaj, yet you read in some of the letters and in the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srila Prabhupada, told that Sridhar was, disobedient to their guru, and that he, by electing this Vasudeva as the next guru for the Gaudiya Math, when he said Bhaktisiddhanta had ordered, the devotees do not elect. No rubber stamping of gurus. So Prabhupada called him out, but he remained friendly basis. All right, Hare Krishna. Let's see. Well, I've been talking about those two and my email exchange, but I haven't actually gotten around to telling you what my counter arguments were that I gave. So here's my analysis, what I wrote regarding their sorely wrong understanding. To understand what it was that Srila Prabhupada had supposedly stopped doing via the July 9th directive, and what he would now be stopping on October 18th, we first need to have a solid understanding of what the Rtvik Representative process was that allegedly Srila Prabhupada had stopped doing on July 9th. On the screen is an excerpt from the July 9th letter that explains exactly what it is that Srila Prabhupada was allegedly supposed to have stopped doing once the Rtvik system began. I will read the embolded text. In the past, temple presidents have written to Srila Prabhupada recommending a particular devotee's initiation. Now that Srila Prabhupada has named these representatives, temple presidents may henceforward send recommendation for first and second initiation to whichever of these 11 representatives are nearest their temple. After considering the recommendation, these representatives may accept the devotees as an initiated disciple of Srila Prabhupada by giving a spiritual name or in the case of second initiation, by chanting on the Gayatri thread, just as Srila Prabhupada has done. The newly initiated devotees are disciples of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Previously, the temple presidents would send their letter of recommendation to Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada would accept those recommendations on his own behalf. He would also then make the final decisions of who would chant on the beads, who will give the spiritual name. He made the final arrangements as well, the decision on the final arrangements. But now, with this July 9th letter, this was the last physical aspect. Everything else Srila Prabhupada had already delegated. He had already delegated giving name for other GBC to give the names, come up with the names. He had already delegated all the other aspects. But this one aspect, this was the final physical aspect of receiving the recommendation. Now, with the July 9th letter, that recommendation, those letters of recommendations were to now go to the nearest Rtvik representative. And they would make the final, they would select the names, they would chant on the beads, and they would make the final arrangements. So that is the only new aspect that is introduced by the July 9th directive. And what that system did is that it removed Srila Prabhupada from being physically involved in the process entirely. Once the Rtvik representative system was active and being followed, then no one would be coming to His Divine Grace and asking him for his recommendations or asking him to make final decisions and no, all of the recommendations were now to be sent to the nearest Rtvik representative. They will then chant on the beads. They will then give the spiritual name. They will then make the final arrangements with who's going to do the fire yajna. And they'll take care of everything from that point. That is what the Rtvik representative of the Acharya system is. And they wouldn't be coming and approaching Srila Prabhupada anymore for any part of that process. Srila Prabhupada wasn't to be involved in that physical part of the initiation process anymore. That was the unique system established by the July 9th directive. But what is happening here in this conversation on October 18th? It appears that these men or others have brought to Srila Prabhupada's attention that there is this Bengali man who is seeking initiation. And here, in this conversation, we see that it is Srila Prabhupada who is the one who is still being pressed by these men. He's in a very weak condition, and he's still being pressed by these men to make the final decisions on whether to accept this person as his disciple. He's being pressed on who will perform the initiation ceremony, on where it should be held, on who is to chant the names, who is to come up with the names, who is to chant on the beads. He's being pressed for this. Since the man is Bengali, Srila Prabhupada asked that Jayapataka do this. Since he is the GBC for Mayapur, which would make him the nearest Rtvik for Mayapur as well. The GBC's argument was based on the premise that Srila Prabhupada had already stopped performing all the other Rtvik aspects of the initiation, and that there was only one thing left for him to do in October, was to stop giving the actual diksha, the actual initiation. But no, rather than Srila Prabhupada had already stopped those functions, the Rtvik functions, and these Rtvik representatives have been doing them since July 9th, rather than what the actual situation was, that as October 18th, those who he had appointed as his Rtvik representatives hadn't even started to perform those Rtvik duties yet. Rather than the Rtvik system had been implemented by them back in July, and they had been receiving the recommendations, and they were the ones who were making the final decisions and chanting on the beads and doing everything and that they had been deputed to do with the July 9th letter. As of October 18th, they hadn't even begun yet to take up those Rtvik duties. Prabhupada had been approached and asked what to do about this Bengali gentleman. He was seeking initiation from Srila Prabhupada. They were asking Prabhupada, well, what should we do about this man, Prabhupada? And as of October 18th, it is Prabhupada who is still having to deal with all of this. He has to decide who's going to perform the functions and who's going to, But he said he had already deputed those men to do so. But they hadn't started yet. Srila Prabhupada was the one who was having to select who, how, where, when, whatever. All of that the Rtviks were now supposed to be doing if they had already implemented the Rtvik system, which they had not done so yet. And if they had, then they wouldn't be approaching Srila Prabhupada. So as you can see, the basic premise of this GBC argument, it's just shattered to dust. And I mean, I hope you can see that. Yet 12 years ago, these two gurus, they couldn't seem to grasp this. And they refused to accept that the GBC's argument wasn't really it after all. Oh, but there's a lot more to my analysis. So notice that Srila Prabhupada is speaking in past tense regarding what he had already deputed Jayapataka to do. He had already deputed him in that list, which is the July 9th letter. Here is a highlighted list of how he referred to what he had already deputed in past tense. Prabhupada, so I have deputed some of you to initiate. So I think Jayapataka can do that. I have already deputed. Tell him. So deputies, Jayapataka's name was there. Bhagavan, it's already there, Srila Prabhupada. His name was on that list. Prabhupada, so I depute him to do this at Mayapur, and you may go with him. I stop for the time being. Is that all right? Tamal Krishna stop doing what, Srila Prabhupada? Prabhupada, this initiation, I have deputed my disciples. Is it clear or not? Giriraj, it's clear. Prabhupada, you have got the list of the names, Tamal Krishna. Yes, Srila Prabhupada. Right at the beginning, Srila Prabhupada says that I have deputed, I have already deputed. Jayapataka's name was there, referring to the list, the July 9th letter. In this whole segment, Srila Prabhupada is only referring to what he has already, in that list, the July 9th letter, deputed him and those men to do. That is the Rtvik aspects. Srila Prabhupada had already deputed Jayapataka to accept the recommendations from the temple presidents in his area. He had already deputed him to come up with the spiritual name. He had already deputed him to chant on the beads. He had already deputed them to do all these functions. Why are they not doing their Rtvik duties that he had already deputed them to do? Instead, they're still coming and pressing Srila Prabhupada to do what he had already deputed them to do, and they hadn't started doing it yet. So all that Prabhupada is doing is telling them, you now start doing your duties. And then he says, he says in the present tense, that I depute him, Jayapataka, to do this in Mayapur. Now, all the other times he had spoken of what he had already deputed them to do in the past tense. So why is he now speaking in present tense? Because they hadn't started doing what he had already deputed them to do yet. So now he's saying, I depute him to do it. Go, do, and do what? This. And what? So what is this? The only thing up to this part of the conversation that Srila Prabhupada had been referring to was what he had already deputed them to do. The Rtvik aspects of the initiation, their Rtvik duties. Since they haven't started doing it, Prabhupada is using the present tense because he is again deputing him to do this, the Rtvik aspects of the initiation. And that's the only thing that was being referred to up to that point in the conversation, what he had already deputed them to do. So now he's deputing him to do this in Mayapur. Then Prabhupada said, I stop. Tamal asked, stop doing what? Stop what? Stopping what, Srila Prabhupada? And Prabhupada says, this initiation. Again, the word this. And again, the only thing that Srila Prabhupada was speaking of in reference to initiation was the Ritvik aspects of the initiation that he had already deputed these men to do. They're in that list, the July 9th letter. And they had been still, on October 18th, they're still coming to Srila Prabhupada and asking what to do about this gentleman, what to do about this Bengali. He wants to be your disciple. And Prabhupada is still being pressed to handle these duties he had already deputed the men to do, but they haven't started doing them yet. So now he is stopping what? He's stopping this initiation. And so, again, he's only been speaking of the Rtvik aspects. And so, the GBC got it wrong again. Another argument that they got wrong again. It wasn't that Srila Prabhupada was saying that he was stopping giving the initiation. In this conversation, he never mentions anything in this conversation about him giving the actual initiation. That was never raised in the conversation. So his use of the word "this" could not be referring to that, because that hadn't been discussed in the conversation. The only thing that he had been referring to in the conversation was the Rtvik. That is what this points to, those Rtvik aspects of the initiation. That what he already had deputed them to do. So Srila Prabhupada is stopping that, the Rtvik aspects. And the rest of Prabhupada's sentence proves this is exactly what he was referring to. The full sentence is, this initiation I have deputed my disciples. Is that clear or not? So he defines and links the words "this initiation" to what he has already deputed those men to do, which was the Rtvik aspects. So, the GBC they got it wrong again. Another argument, failed argument, that is just not there. And I'm just so, not amazed, but I can't think right now of a different word to say, but how the GBC men can give such arguments that they give. The first thing when I read the transcript for the first time, it was the past tense use of the words that it was so blatant. I have already deputed him. I have deputed him. His name was there. Everything was past tense about what Srila Prabhupada was referring to. It was past tense. It was there in that list. I've already deputed him. What did he depute him to do? The Rtvik aspects. It's something in the past. He never once talked about giving actual diksha. So how could this initiation refer to something he hadn't even been talking about? The only thing this could refer to is what he had been talking about in the conversation. So to me, everything was just clear. It was just so simple. It was very clear. And that's why I say it amazes me how the GBC can go so wrong on these arguments. And it's not just one time, but it's time after time the GBC takes such strong arguments on a nothing is really there at all argument. And anyway, as I said, it's because they are trying to come up with arguments to defend and support a path and a system that they were never supposed to be on. A multi-guru path, a multi-guru system that it has no foundation anywhere in Srila Prabhupada's teachings. No guidance was given to him about how it was to work. The path they are on is totally wrong. It is baseless. And so time after time, their arguments to support that path wind up becoming nothing is really there as well. Their so-called proof turns into poof and disappears as soon as we start to analyze them. Srila Prabhupada's last comment was, Prabhupada, and if by Krishna's grace I recover from this condition, then I shall begin again. Or I may not be pressed in this condition to initiate. It is not good. Now, Srila Prabhupada says that he may not be pressed in this condition. It is not good. And what does he mean by being pressed? Because 3.5 months earlier, he had authorized 11 men to take the responsibility of validating the initiations on his behalf. He had delegated the duty for them to take charge and handle all the other aspects, decisions, and physical aspects of the initiation process. And that he did this so that he would no longer be pressed to deal with it, that he would no longer be involved physically with those aspects of it. He would remain the giver of the spiritual initiation, but he was no longer to be physically pressed into being physically involved, especially not when his condition was so weak. Then it is not good. It is not good for him to be pressed into having to deal with this, into the physical aspects of the initiation process, when he had already deputed those men to do so on his behalf. Now, I'll just give one other point, because some people say, well, Prabhupada said that he could again do it. He could again do that. And they say, I don't know how, but they turn that into an argument against the Ritvik. I don't know how, but Prabhupada, if his health recovered, yes, instead of sending the letters of recommendation to the nearest Rtvik, he could again say, continue to send to him. But that doesn't mean that wasn't the process he wanted for when he is no longer present. It doesn't invalidate the process at all. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. So I explained all of this, and I gave my analysis and conclusions, and sent my email back first to Trivikram, and he accused me of being fallen because I refused to accept the GBC's analysis. Why should I? If their analysis is completely wrong, and I have proven it wrong, I have totally torn their analysis apart, then how is that fallen for me? How is that being insubordinate? How is it? If someone gives an argument and you defeat their argument, that makes you insubordinate? It makes no sense. Anyway, let me go on.